Welcome everybody. We're really glad that you're joining us tonight with the next installment in our GROBigRed virtual program series. And we're going to be talking about tree problems, as you already know. You know, I usually save resources to the very end, and they kind of get rushed through because usually we're running out of time at the very end of a presentation. So I wanted to put these right up front for you. Some great resources that you can find for more additional information on trees. The first grouping I want to just show you here real quick is a series of publications that were put together by the Nebraska Forest Service. The Nebraska Forest Service put together this series of publications, and hopefully you're seeing them now. And there's one called Insect Pest of Evergreen Trees. There is Insect Pests of Broadleaf Trees, Diseases of Evergreen Trees, Diseases of Broadleaf Trees, and then there's a fifth one called Abiotic Problems of Trees. And if you Google these publications, I'm sure you'll be able to pull them up. And what I like about them is that they give you a very brief synopsis of what the problem is, what are the common symptoms. They give you some pictures so you can figure out what it looks like, and then they give you control recommendations. So these are a really nice little quick guide to help you with some of the problems that we deal with on a regular basis. So here for diseases of broadleaf trees, you can see we're talking about leaf diseases like anthracnose, cankers, verticillium wilt. On the second page of this, they get into apple scab, cedar apple rust, and so on. So they cover some of the most common diseases that we deal with in our trees in Nebraska. So I would really encourage you to refer to those publications, and they provide a lot of great information. Now, the other resource that I wanted to share with you, Elizabeth had mentioned earlier, and that was the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum plant lists. And if you go to Plant Nebraska, which is the Statewide Arboretum's website, and click on Native Plants, you will find several different lists of trees. They do trees for eastern Nebraska, trees for western Nebraska, trees for special locations. They're broken down by size in some publications, as Elizabeth mentioned, but it's a great way to get some quick suggestions if you're looking for some ideas on trees that might work for your landscape. So I just wanted to point those resources out really quick. One other resource that I wanted to make you aware of, after this program, if you have questions about trees or problems you need help with, I would encourage you to visit our digital diagnostic network. And all of the extension folks here on the program tonight are experts that answer questions through the digital diagnostic network. So when you first visit this site, you're going to create a profile for yourself. It's free. There's no cost to it. And then you'll be able to submit questions and pictures directly to the DDN network. And then whoever is the best expert to answer the question will give you a response. The nice thing about the digital diagnostic network is that you know, it doesn't matter if one or two of us are not in our offices. We all look at this and answer questions that are submitted through the network, so that it helps ensure that you get a quick response to your question. Okay, so I would encourage you to check that out. All right. So we're going to jump in first. We're going to talk about abiotic problems. Then we're going to talk about leaf diseases, stem and branch diseases, trunk diseases. My goal with this first part of the presentation is to give you some ideas of some of the common problems that we deal with, and then get on to your specific questions. Okay. So these abiotic problems, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on these because coming up, one of the next programs in our series is tree planting. And a lot of these abiotic problems are dealt with at planting. So I don't want to spend too much time on them. But we know that we have tree problems that are related to production and planting. And we know we have problems that are related to management issues. All right. So the planting issues have to do with things like planting depth. You can see the picture on the far left. See how the trunk goes straight into the ground like the sides of a telephone pole, and we don't see a nice root flare. There's no flare at the base of this tree, okay? As opposed to this healthy tree in the lower center picture, where it reminds me of like an elephant's foot, where the trunk comes down and then it really widens out. And that is what we want to see on a well-planted tree. It indicates the tree is planted at the right depth. So what's the big deal about planting depth? Well, tree roots do need to pull up oxygen from the soil. And the deeper the roots are placed in the soil, the less oxygen they will be able to pull up. That impacts the overall development of the tree's root system, and it impacts the tree for its whole life. So it's important to get trees planted at the correct depth. Then in the top center picture, you see a stem girdling root, where the stem is wrapping around the trunk, and eventually it will start to press into the trunk enough that it will compress the cambium, and very likely the bark above the stem girdling root will die. And so the tree that you're seeing on the far right, this is this tree from the middle with the stem girdling root. This is this tree full scale. So you can see what's happening in the canopy of that tree, where that stem is wrapping around the trunk. The tree was having trouble moving water up through that section of the trunk, which translated into leaf scorch and branch dieback in the canopy, okay? So stem girdling roots can be a very significant problem for trees, and they usually originate during plant production, when trees are grown as seedlings in circular containers, and the tree roots hit the edge of those container walls, they start to grow in a circle. And if those roots are not corrected when the tree is planted, then eventually you end up with this kind of a situation. And this can be a very serious long-term health problem for a tree. In fact, a lot of times when people call us with tree problems, we'll end up telling them, oh, this is not a disease, this is actually a leaf scorch, and we'll start talking to them about planting depth and stem girdling roots, okay? So these are serious issues, and they're very, very common, okay? One other thing I'll just point out here before I move on, in this tree that is planted at the wrong depth, you see we have a section of bark that has died at the base of this trunk. And that can often be a result of planting depth. You know, as we get poor root development on trees that are planted at too deeply, that can sometimes translate into bark death in the upper trunk. Okay. So planting issues cause us a lot of problems. We also know that management issues cause us a lot of problems with our trees. And so here, all of these pictures are related to water issues. In the far right, we've got needle scorch that occurred in the winter as a tree was not able to pull up water enough, and the water was pulled out of the needles due to either hot, dry conditions in the summer, or this can also happen in the winter, and we can end up with needle scorch in the springtime. In the middle two pictures, you see a marginal leaf scorch. This is just related to dryness. These trees are scorched because they're not able to pull up enough water during hot, dry conditions. Sometimes we'll see leaf scorch occur if a tree is overhanging a very hot surface like a road, or it gets a lot of reflected heat from a building. So, and this is just lack of water, so it's just an abiotic condition. Then the trees in the right are arborvitae that have suffered winter desiccation, a lack of water during the winter months, and we ended up with this type of damage in the spring. So none of these are disease related or caused by insects. They're all a function of how the trees are managed, specifically water. Okay. So the final abiotic issues I'm going to talk about tonight are management issues. So the two pictures on the far right, you see we've got what we call mower blight, you know, where the trees have been hit and we have physical damage to the trunk. These trees are not going to live very long because so much of the trunk, the bark on the trunk has been damaged. The pictures on the right are mulch issues. And you can see in the top picture, we have what we call a mulch volcano, where the mulch is piled up against the trunk of the tree. And this is really bad because it holds moisture against the trunk, which can result in bark rots, death of the bark. And it also serves as harborage for moles during the winter, voles with a V, and they can chew on the bark and they can cause physical damage. as they are feeding on the bark during the winter months. And this is really frustrating for me because I drive around and look at landscapes in commercial buildings and other commercial facilities, and you see these mulch volcanoes so commonly. It's more uncommon to see it done right than it is to see the volcanoes. It's almost to the point where people seem to think that this is right, to pile the mulch up against the trunk, but it's really not. In the lower picture, you can see they've almost got it right. They've got a much flatter layer of mulch, but it's still piled up against the trunk about 6 inches or so. So we really would want to pull that back and flatten that mulch out even a little bit more. Okay, so those are some of the abiotic problems that we run across in trees. The final one is Sunscald, and this is a very common problem that we see in maples. Particularly because when maple trees are young and the bark is thin, during the winter months, the bark on the south and the west side of a tree can oftentimes heat up almost to air temperature during the day. And then if we have a big temperature drop at night, you get ice crystals forming between the cells, and it causes death of the bark, basically. So you see, and again, we very, very commonly see this happening on the south or the west side of young trees that have thin bark, and it results in death of the bark. Now, in the lower picture, you see the tree is trying to put out some new tissue, which is called callus tissue, to grow over and seal over the damaged section. The best case scenario is that eventually the tree will seal off that wound. But we know that there will be wood rot that will enter into that tree during the years that it takes that wound to seal over. So this is a very serious health problem on the tree. On the right, you see a much smaller trunk, which also has Sunscald issues. And you can see we've got some wood rot little mushrooms that are starting to grow on that trunk as that bark has died and the inner wood starts to rot away. So very, very common abiotic problems that we see in trees. Oftentimes, one of the first things I will ask people when they're asking me about a tree problem is, do you see any damage to the trunk? Is there any damage to the bark? Do you see any wounds or any dead sections of bark? And that's a good place to help figure out what's going on with the tree. Okay, so before we jump into looking at diseases and insects, I wanted to make just a general comment about shade trees or deciduous trees versus evergreen trees. Because as we talk about leaf or needle problems, those issues are much more serious on evergreens, because evergreens don't have the ability to regenerate those needles once they are damaged or have died. Whereas deciduous trees put on a new canopy of foliage every year. So with some of the pests and pathogens we're going to talk about here, they're much less serious in shade trees, but on the other hand, they can be very serious in evergreen trees. So deciding the seriousness of a problem, one of the first things I look at is, am I looking at a shade tree or is this a deciduous tree that we're talking about? Okay, so we're going to look real quickly at some common leaf problems. And this is not by any means inclusive list. This is just very short, just to give you some examples of the most common problems that we see in trees, okay? Diseases include anthracnose, the rusts like cedar apple rust, cedar hawthorn rust, and then Rhizosphere and Needlecast, which is a disease we see in spruce quite often. Then insects, which include bagworms, Japanese beetles, spider mites, and then scorch, which is a leaf problem we already looked at a little bit. Okay, so here are some common shade tree leaf problems. Okay, how many of you out there have a leaf or have a tree that has leaf spots on it right now? I'm wondering if we have anybody on the program tonight who has an ornamental pear that has almost turned orange because it has so much infection with rust this year. Okay. Cedar apple rust, which is the picture you see here in the middle, also affects pears. And the pears have been just hammered by rust diseases this year. I've never seen it so bad in my career as a horticulturist. But the nice thing about this disease and about both cedar apple rust and anthracnose is that they're just leaf diseases, and they affect the foliage. They don't affect the underlying twigs. They don't have a huge impact on the health of the tree overall. So, you know, that can give you some peace of mind, hopefully, okay? We get questions right now with people who have ornamental pears that have severe infections about control. It's too late to control now. These diseases have to be controlled with fungicides that are applied in the spring just as the leaves are emerging. So there's no point in control at this point in the season, okay? So another leaf problem, as you see in the picture on the right, is Japanese beetles. This happens to be a linden, and Japanese beetles love linden trees. If you drive around in eastern Nebraska, this is a very common sight. So people are asked, well, is my tree dying? Are they going to kill my tree? No. Again, this is a deciduous tree. It can tolerate the leaf loss. Even if it's almost completely defoliated, this tree will leaf out again just fine next spring, and it'll have very little impact on the tree overall. Okay. But when we talk about leaf diseases in evergreens, it's much more serious proposition. So what we're looking at here on the left-hand side are 2 Colorado spruces with Rhizosphere and Needlecast. And so the symptoms that we see on Needlecast, and actually, I'm just going to go right now to some of the email questions that have been submitted, because we've got a great picture here. Let's see, I guess I need to, let's see. Are you seeing my email now? No? Okay. So I have to reshare.
Now we are.
Oh, now you are?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Well, we were.
Bring
it back to wherever you had it.
Now, can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So these were some pictures that were sent by Carol Martin earlier today. And I guess that doesn't enlarge very much. So Carol's tree is a concolor fir, which can also be affected by Rhizosphere and Needlecast. So where you're seeing that the older needles on the inner part of the branches are turning brown, this is a common symptom of Rhizosphere and Needlecast. And if you look at the needles very closely, what you would see would be little black fungal structures that would be growing out of the stomata, or the white dots that you typically see on an evergreen leaf. The fungal infection affects the older needles, so it affects the needles on the inner parts of the branch, and it causes them to fall early. So what happens on a tree that's severely affected is that the tree ends up looking thin. And let's see, let me go. Carol had some, okay, so there's another picture. Let me go to this tree. These are Lori's pictures of Lori's spruce, and you see how the spruce is thinner. It's thinner than it should be. It should have more needles than this. And if we go to some of Lori's close-ups, you see how these needles are turning brown, the older needles. And then if you were to look at those with a hand magnifying lens or with under a microscope, it's very likely that you would see the black fungal structures that are indicative of Rhizosphere and Needlecast. Okay. And you can see the discoloration of some of these older needles. So that's one of the common symptoms that we see, or one of the common causes of, discoloration or early dropping of the older needles on spruces and firs. Okay. If you're going to control that, you would need to do a fungicide application in the spring as the new growth is emerging. And I'm going to refer you back to those Nebraska Forest Service publications that I mentioned earlier, specifically the one on diseases of evergreen trees. And if you print yourself off a copy of that, it gives you a list of the chemicals that are recommended for use and the timing when those applications should be made. But they're made in the spring as the new growth is just emerging. So here in the middle, we see another needle problem. This is bagworms. You see the all these little cocoon-like structures that are hanging down on the undersides of the branches are the pupation sacs of bagworms. And bagworms just eat the needles. They eat the needles off. But if they totally defoliate a branch of an evergreen, then there's a good chance that that branch will die because it doesn't have any needles to photosynthesize and to keep that branch alive. So bagworms are a very serious problem on evergreens. Now, we quite commonly see bagworms on deciduous trees too, but they're not a big issue because they feed on a few leaves. The tree will leaf out again next year, not a big problem. But on evergreens, bagworms are a big, big issue, okay? The picture that you see to the right is spider mite damage. And we see two different mites that affect spruces in Nebraska. One is called the spruce mite, which is active in the spring, usually April into May. And then in the summer, we see the two-spotted spider mite, which is active. And again, what we'll see is discoloration of the older needles because the mites tend to feed on the inner parts, the inner needles. So when I get a question like from Carol or Linda, I think it was, with trees that have discolored needles on the inner part of the canopy, the first thing I look for is mites. The second thing I look for is Rhizosphere and Needlecast. Okay. Okay. So let's look real quickly at some branch and trunk problems, and we'll go through these. So what you see on the left-hand picture there is fire blight, which is a common problem that we see in some of our fruit trees, and and also some ornamentals, like ornamental pears sometimes have fire blight. Usually, fire blight is a disease that, and you see in this picture where there's a rough section of the stem right there, where the disease has actually infected the bark of the stem. That is what we would call a canker. And when fire blight infects the stem that way, you know, everything from that point out will die. Typically, fire blight is controlled through pruning off the diseased sections of the tree, and then sometimes through some fungicide applications, or actually.
He's getting confused with their pictures.
Sorry. Are you seeing the branch and twig pictures on your screen right now? Okay, just want to make sure. So in the middle picture, of course, we're going back to an evergreen here. This is another very common fungal disease we see on evergreens, but in this case, it causes the new growth to die. Instead of the older needles dying, in this case, we have the new growth. And if it reinfects the tree year after year, it can cause branches to die back, okay? On the far right, we're seeing diploidea tip blight, which again is very common in Austrian and ponderosa pines. It affects the new growth. You see the new candles here on this branch. The new candles have died. And in a really severe infection year, it can also cause branch dieback. But this is extremely common in our longer needle pines. And when someone tells me they have an Austrian or a ponderosa that is getting thin, quite often this is one of the problems with the tree, okay? So remember again, you know, with some of these needle and branch problems, they tend to be somewhat more serious in evergreens than they are in deciduous trees. Although that's not to say that fire blight infection can't be extremely serious in certain situations, but it's usually a little easier to control than the problems in evergreens. Okay. Then I just pulled out a couple of pests that cause trunk damage to trees in Nebraska. And of course, emerald ash borer, we've been talking about this for quite a while. And you can see from the map there where it has been confirmed now in the state. The most recent confirmations this summer were Kearney, and then Seward, I believe it was Washington County, I think was the other confirmation just recently. But the insect causes damage by tunneling. The immature larva tunnels underneath the bark in the cambium area, and it kills the cambium and destroys the tree's ability to move water up from the root system. And so the branches die back, as you see in the tree, the picture to the left, and eventually the whole tree dies if the insect is not controlled. But something that's a lot more insidious and harder to spot are the pictures on the right, which is oyster shell scale. And sometimes we'll get calls from folks who say, I have a tree that has branches that are dying back, but they don't really see anything that looks obviously wrong. But when they bring us samples of the branches, we'll see these tiny, tiny little shells on the stems. And you can see them also here as these little rough spots on the stem of this maple tree. But oyster shell scales are very, very tiny. But when there's very high numbers of them, their feeding can disrupt the cambium and the water movement of a tree or shrub, and it can cause branch dieback very, very commonly. We see oyster shell scales on lilacs quite a bit, and on quite a few other shrubs in the landscape. Okay. So when you're trying to figure out what's going on with your plant, it's important to take a really close look for symptoms and signs like presence of oyster shell scale. And this is something that you're going to have to look really closely for because they're so small. Okay. Now, there aren't a whole lot of diseases that affect an entire tree uniformly, but one of the few diseases that does that is pine wilt. And pine wilt is a disease we've been dealing with in Nebraska for about 12 or 15 years. It affects primarily Scotch pine. And so as you can see in these two pictures here, this is a Scotch pine that used to be on East Campus. The picture on the right was taken in August 20th of 2003. The picture on the right was taken just a few days later in September 2nd. So you can see how quickly the whole tree went off color and died. And this is the effects of a nematode that gets into the trunks of the tree, that reproduces and destroys again the tree's ability to move water. And so the tree basically just wilts and dies. But there's very few problems that will kill an entire tree as quickly as pine wilt does. Okay, so I wanted to give you again a list of some of the common landscape pest control products that could be used if you needed to control a disease or an insect. And so I've got those listed for you here. The problem with trees is that oftentimes if you're trying to control the pest, the answer is you have to spray the tree. And if you're dealing with a large shade tree, in many cases, that's not something that homeowners can do easily. So again, if it's a leaf disease, whether it's a disease or an insect, I should say, on a deciduous tree, remember that typically that is not going to have a really large impact on the health of the tree. But if it's an evergreen, it's a little more serious. And if it's a really high value specimen tree for you, it might be worthwhile to control the insect or the disease with some type of a pesticide application. Okay. And again, if you take a look at the publications that the Forest Service has put together for each different pest, they'll give you the timing and then the products that are used for control of that specific pest.